the silence that follows death is never complete. For Eleanor Blackwood, it arrived first as a pressure, then as a voice. October 17th, 1831. The plantation house stood cold on the outskirts of Wilmington, North Carolina, its white columns catching the last light of day. Inside, Eleanor sat motionless in her late husband's study, her mourning dress arranged in perfect pleats around her slender frame. It had been exactly 41 days since they buried Thomas Blackwood. The doctor had called it a cerebral hemorrhage, a sudden rupture that took him in his sleep. But what the doctor couldn't explain was why, on this evening, as Eleanor pressed her fingertips to her jaw to soothe an aching tooth, she heard her husband's voice emerge from her own mouth. "Eleanor," it said, so soft she thought it might have been the wind through the cypress trees. "I never left." She jerked her hand away, heart pounding against her ribs. The study remained empty, except for the lingering scent of Thomas's pipe tobacco. Eleanor closed her eyes, convinced her grief had finally broken something essential inside her mind. But when her fingers returned to brush against her aching molar, the voice came again, clearer this time. "There are things I could not tell you in life." Eleanor gasped, her hand trembling as she pulled it away. The voice stopped immediately. It was only when her fingers returned to her jawline that the whispers continued, as if Thomas's words traveled through bone and tooth rather than air, as if something of him had embedded itself inside her very skeleton. Records from Dr. James Harlow, the family physician, document Eleanor's first visit to his office the following morning. His notes describe a widow, possessed of unusual nervousness, who complained of auditory disturbances coinciding with dental discomfort. Dr. Harlow prescribed laudanum for her nerves and suggested the extraction of the troublesome tooth, but Eleanor refused. The voice that came through her teeth was her only connection to Thomas, and what he was beginning to tell her, about the ledgers in his desk, about the true source of the Blackwood fortune, about the people who worked their land against their will, was something she could not unhear, even as it horrified her. "The plantation papers are false," Thomas's voice told her that night as she sat alone in their bedroom, fingers pressed hard against her jaw. "The truth lies beneath the floorboards of the Eastern storehouse. What was done to them was done in my name." By the first light of dawn, Eleanor found herself at the abandoned storehouse at the edge of the cotton fields. The structure hadn't been used since before her marriage to Thomas 5 years earlier. The door creaked open under her touch, revealing nothing but dusty emptiness. But when she knelt and pried up the rotted floorboards, she found a small tin box containing documents yellowed with age, records of human beings bought and sold, not for labor as she had always believed, but for something far worse. Names and prices were listed in Thomas's neat handwriting, dates of purchase, dates of death, and between them, clinical descriptions of procedures performed, removals, extractions, experimentations. Eleanor's world collapsed around her as she realized what her husband had been. Not just a plantation owner, but a man who had used his medical education from Edinburgh to conduct secret surgeries on the enslaved people he owned, driven by theories about human anatomy that proper science had long since abandoned. Thomas Blackwood had turned human beings into specimens, all while maintaining the veneer of a respected Southern gentleman. Why would his voice return to tell her this? What atonement was he seeking through her teeth? That night, as autumn winds rattled the windows of the plantation house, Eleanor pressed her fingers to her jaw once more, waiting for Thomas to speak. But this time, another voice emerged, a woman's voice, unfamiliar and desperate. "My name was Ruth," it said. "I died beneath his knife in 1827. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You need to witness these forgotten histories that shaped our world but remain buried in whispers and shadows." By November, the voices had multiplied. Each night, Eleanor would sit in Thomas's study, her fingers pressed against her aching tooth, and listen as the dead spoke through her. Their names formed a litany: Ruth, Samuel, Ezekiel, Mary, John, Rebecca. Each had suffered under Thomas's obsession with what he called the architecture of pain. experiments designed to map how suffering traveled through the human body. In his private journals, which Eleanor discovered hidden behind a false panel in the library, Thomas had written of his belief that pain itself could be extracted like a tooth and transferred from one body to another. He believed pain had mass, Samuel's voice told her one evening, that it could be measured and contained. The winter of 1831 descended on coastal North Carolina with unusual ferocity. Ice formed in the marshes, and fog hung low over the cotton fields. Eleanor withdrew from whatever society Wilmington offered, declining invitations and turning away visitors. Servants whispered about their mistress's strange behavior, how she would stand motionless for hours, one hand pressed against her jaw, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. How she had ordered Thomas's surgical instruments brought to her room. How she had begun to fill notebooks with anatomical drawings that looked nothing like any medical text they had ever seen. "I am becoming the repository," Eleanor wrote in her journal on December 12th. "My teeth hold their voices. My bones remember their pain. Thomas has made me the ledger of his sins." The voices were specific about what they wanted: justice. Not vengeance, but acknowledgement. They wanted to be named, their suffering recorded, their humanity restored in memory. And they guided Eleanor to discover more evidence of what Thomas had done, not just at the Blackwood plantation, but at others throughout New Hanover County. His experiments had been extensive, cloaked in secrecy, but nevertheless known to other plantation owners who had either participated or looked away. Eleanor began to compile a document of testimony, not just the voices that came through her teeth, but also accounts from those still living who had witnessed Thomas's work. House servants who had cleaned his surgical room, field hands who had seen people disappear into the eastern storehouse, never to return, even neighboring planters who had attended Thomas's private lectures on what he called differential anatomy. "It was not just my husband," Eleanor confided to her journal in January. "It was an entire system of knowledge built on broken bodies, a science of suffering with its own philosophy, its own practitioners, its own records." The most troubling discovery came when Eleanor followed the instructions of a voice that identified itself as Ezekiel. He guided her to a hollow cypress tree at the edge of the property, where Thomas had hidden correspondence with physicians in Charleston, Savannah, and even Philadelphia, doctors who had requested specimens and preparations from Thomas's unique collection. Eleanor's dental pain intensified as winter deepened. The tooth that had first channeled Thomas's voice now throbbed constantly, the gum around it swollen and hot to the touch. Dr. Harlow, upon examining her in early February, insisted on extraction. "The infection is spreading to the bone, Mrs. Blackwood," he warned. "If we do not remove the tooth, you risk a far more serious condition." But Eleanor refused once more. The voices had become her mission, her purpose. Without them, who would speak for the dead? Who would document what had been done? On February 17, 1832, exactly 4 months after she first heard Thomas's voice, Eleanor made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. Using her husband's surgical instruments and following detailed instructions from the voices, she performed an extraction of her own, not of the infected tooth, but of a healthy molar on the opposite side. "Pain travels," Thomas's voice had told her. "It can be redirected." The agony was excruciating, but when it subsided, Eleanor found that the infection in her other tooth had begun to recede. More importantly, the voices remained, now stronger than before. They spoke not just when she touched her jaw, but continuously, a chorus of the dead guiding her hands as she transcribed their testimonies. What she could not know was that others had begun to notice her work. Thomas's former colleagues, plantation owners who had participated in his experiments, and physicians who had received his specimens, all had heard rumors of the widow's strange behavior and the document she was compiling. They understood the danger she represented to the entire social and economic order of the South. On the first night of March, as Eleanor sat writing by candlelight, she heard a new sound, not through her teeth, but through the air. Horses approaching, men's voices, and then the crash of the front door being forced open. They came for her notes first. 3 men in dark coats who identified themselves as colleagues of her late husband. They called themselves the Wilmington Medical Society, though no such organization had ever been publicly acknowledged. "Mrs. Blackwood," the eldest of them said, a tall man with silver at his temples who introduced himself as Dr. William Carver. "We understand you've been experiencing some mental disturbances since Thomas's passing. We're here to help." Eleanor stood in the center of Thomas's study, her body between the men and the desk where her testimonial documents lay. The voices in her teeth had fallen silent, but she could feel them vibrating through her jawbone, a warning pressure. "My mind is perfectly sound," she replied, "though I cannot say the same for the conscience of this county." The men exchanged glances. Dr. Carver stepped forward, his hand extended as if in comfort, but Eleanor saw the small glass bottle concealed in his palm. Laudanum or something stronger, meant to render her unconscious while they searched the house. What happened next was documented in the journal of Dr. Carver, recovered decades later during renovations to his Wilmington home. He described how Eleanor Blackwood, a woman known for her gentility and reserve, suddenly attacked him with the ferocity of one possessed, using one of her husband's scalpels that she had concealed in the folds of her dress. The blade caught him across the forearm, drawing a line of blood that stained his white cuff. In the confusion, Eleanor fled the study, locking the door behind her. The men's shouts echoed through the house as she rushed to the servants' quarters, waking Daniel, an older man who had been born on the plantation and who Eleanor had discovered had secretly assisted some of Thomas's victims in their final moments. "They've come for the testimonies," she told him breathlessly. "We must hide them." Daniel nodded once, his eyes grave with understanding. "The marsh," he said. "There's a place." While the doctors broke down the study door, Eleanor and Daniel gathered the documents, the journals, and most importantly, the ledger of names, every person who had suffered under Thomas's knife. They worked in frantic silence, binding the papers in oilcloth to protect them from the water. By the time the men realized Eleanor had fled the house, she and Daniel were already moving through the cypress swamp that bordered the eastern edge of the plantation, the night air heavy with the scent of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. The voices guided them, speaking not just through Eleanor's teeth now, but seeming to emerge from the darkness around them. Directions, warnings, the collective memory of those who had fled through these same swamps in desperate bids for freedom. "They never found most of us," said Ruth's voice, clearer than Eleanor had ever heard it. "Our bodies were left to sink beneath the water." Daniel led Eleanor to an ancient cypress, its massive trunk split by lightning decades earlier. Inside the hollow core, above the waterline, was a small shelf of dry wood, a hiding place used by those attempting escape for generations. There, they sealed the testimonies inside a metal box that had once held Thomas's surgical instruments. "If anything happens to me," Eleanor told Daniel, "you must ensure these records survive. The truth must be known." Daniel's reply was interrupted by the sound of dogs barking in the distance. The doctors had summoned help, the same men and hounds used to track down those who fled the plantations. Eleanor and Daniel separated, hoping at least one of them would evade capture. As Eleanor moved deeper into the swamp, the voices grew louder, more insistent. They no longer came just from her teeth, but seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her feet. The marsh itself was speaking, revealing its secrets, the bodies hidden beneath its surface, the suffering absorbed into the landscape. I want everyone watching this to comment. Could a landscape hold the memory of pain, or are we just vessels for the stories we choose to hear? She was captured just before dawn, discovered huddled against a cypress knee, her dress soaked and muddied, her skin scratched from branches. The official report claimed she was raving about voices from the dead and making wild accusations against respected members of society. Dr. A. Carver and his associates brought her not to the local jail, but to a private sanatorium outside Wilmington, a discreet institution where inconvenient members of wealthy families could be kept out of public view. There, according to admission records dated March 3, 1832, Eleanor Blackwood was diagnosed with acute melancholia with delusional features and scheduled for immediate treatment. The treatment, as detailed in Dr. Carver's private notes, included the complete extraction of all her teeth. The patient exhibits the disturbing belief that the spirits of the dead speak through her dental structures, he wrote. Removal of these channels of delusion represents the only hope for recovery. What Dr. Carver could not have anticipated was that Eleanor Blackwood had prepared for this possibility. Before her capture, she had entrusted something to Daniel, not just the testimonial documents, but something far more personal, the tooth she had extracted from herself, wrapped in a small piece of silk and sealed with wax. Within that tooth, she believed, resided the voices of all those who had suffered under her husband's experiments. While Eleanor lay strapped to a chair in the sanatorium, Daniel undertook a journey that would transform her private testimony into public record. The voices had given him a name, Eliza Fenton, a Quaker woman in Philadelphia who had corresponded with Thomas Blackwood under the pretense of scientific interest while actually documenting abuses against enslaved people throughout the South. The marsh had not claimed all its secrets that night. Truth, like pain, finds ways to travel. The sanatorium perched on a hilltop 5 miles outside Wilmington, its white walls and green shutters presenting an image of pastoral tranquility that belied the practices within. Eleanor Blackwood's room overlooked a carefully tended garden where patients deemed sufficiently docile were permitted to walk under supervision. She was not among them. Following the extraction of her teeth, a procedure performed without adequate anesthesia and documented in Dr. Carver's clinical notes as proceeding despite considerable resistance from the subject, Eleanor was kept in isolation, her meals delivered as thin gruel that required no chewing, her interactions limited to brief visits from attendants who regarded her with a mixture of fear and pity. What the doctors could not have known was that removing Eleanor's teeth had not silenced the voices. Instead, it had allowed them to spread, to inhabit not just her jaw, but her entire skeletal structure. The pain of the extractions had opened new channels through which the dead could speak, not in words now, but in sensations, memories, and knowledge that flowed through her like electricity through copper wire. Eleanor began to understand that what Thomas had discovered in his terrible experiments was real, if not in the way he had imagined. Pain did have substance. Memory could transfer from one body to another. The dead could speak, not through supernatural means, but through the physical record of trauma inscribed in bone and flesh and earth. What she experienced was not madness, but an unprecedented form of knowing. In her isolation, Eleanor developed a new method of documentation. Denied paper and ink, she used the only tools available to her, a sliver of wood prized from the window frame and her own blood, drawn by pressing the wood against the thin skin of her inner arm. On the underside of her bed frame, she began to transcribe the knowledge that flowed through her bones. Names, dates, procedures, locations of remains, the entire network of physicians who had participated in or benefited from Thomas's work. The broader implications of their research and how it had informed medical education throughout America. The ways in which science had been corrupted to justify and sustain the institution of slavery. They believed suffering had different qualities in different bodies, she wrote in her hidden script. That pain followed racial pathways. That some were made to endure what others could not. Their science was built on this lie. Meanwhile, Daniel had reached Philadelphia, carrying with him both the documentary evidence of Thomas Blackwood's experiments and Eleanor's extracted tooth. The journey had been perilous, a black man traveling alone through slave states, carrying materials that would be considered seditious. But the voices had guided him, just as they had guided Eleanor, providing knowledge of safe houses and sympathetic contacts along the Underground Railroad. Eliza Fenton received him on April 10, 1832. Her diary entry from that date reads, "Today I was visited by D, who brings with him the most disturbing evidence of medical atrocities committed in N. Carolina. More unsettling still is his account of Mrs. B, who claims to have become a vessel for the testimonies of the deceased. He has brought with him a tooth extracted from the lady's jaw, which he insists contains these voices. While I cannot verify such a claim, the documents accompanying this strange relic are unfortunately all too credible." Fenton, a woman of both scientific education and moral conviction, recognized the importance of what Daniel had brought her. The testimonial documents provided evidence of crimes that many in the abolitionist movement had long suspected but had been unable to prove. That slavery enabled not just economic exploitation and physical brutality, but also scientific experimentation, unconstrained by ethics or oversight. Within weeks, Fenton had produced an anonymized report titled On Certain Medical Practices in the Southern States, which she circulated among select abolitionist circles and medical reformers in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. While careful to present the information as accounts from credible witnesses rather than established fact, a necessary precaution against libel charges, the report caused immediate disquiet among those who read it. Dr. I. Carver and his associates became aware of the report by early May. The reaction was swift. The sanatorium where Eleanor was held experienced an unexplained fire on May 11, 1832. The official account stated that all patients and most staff were safely evacuated, with only 3 casualties, all women patients in the North Wing, where Eleanor had been confined. County death records include a certificate for Eleanor Blackwood, listing the cause as misadventure by fire. Her remains were reportedly buried in an unmarked plot on the sanatorium grounds, the ceremony attended only by a representative of the family lawyer. This might have been the end of the story, were it not for what happened next. In June 1832, a woman calling herself Mrs. Helen Bishop appeared in Philadelphia, seeking Eliza Fenton. Witnesses described her as slender, soft-spoken, and of respectable appearance despite signs of recent hardship. Most notably, she wore a silk scarf always wrapped around the lower portion of her face, which she explained was necessary due to injuries sustained in a fire. Mrs. Bishop brought with her additional documentary evidence regarding the Blackwood experiments, evidence that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the case. More disturbing still, she demonstrated an uncanny ability to speak about the experiences of Thomas's victims, describing details of procedures and conversations that had never been included in the written record. Fenton's diary suggests initial skepticism. Mrs. B, if it is indeed her, as D insists, speaks as though she were channeling the voices of those who suffered. While I cannot accept such literal interpretation, I cannot deny the power and specificity of her testimony. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Bishop worked with Fenton and a small circle of trusted allies to compile a comprehensive account of the Blackwood case and its broader implications. They conducted discreet investigations to verify details independently, confirming names, dates, and connections that supported the narrative. By August, they had prepared a dossier that documented not just Thomas Blackwood's individual crimes, but the entire network of medical experimentation occurring throughout the South. A systemic abuse of power protected by wealth, professional authority, and the institution of slavery itself. But before this dossier could be published or presented to authorities, Mrs. Bishop disappeared. Fenton's final diary entry regarding her, dated August 29, 1832, reads, H departed this morning before dawn. She left only a note. The voices call me home. There is more work to be done where the bones lie buried. I fear we shall not meet again in this life. Eleanor Blackwood, or the woman who had claimed her identity, had returned to North Carolina, drawn back by the knowledge that continued to flow through her reconstructed body. The voices had shown her that Thomas's experiments were ongoing, continued by his colleagues despite the exposure of his work. There were still those suffering under the knife. There were still bodies being consigned to the marsh. There was still truth to be extracted. Wilmington in the late summer of 1832 simmered with unspoken tension. Rumors of slave unrest circulated among the plantation owners, fueled by the recent Nat Turner rebellion in Virginia and by mysterious incidents closer to home. Medical records disappearing from physicians' offices, small fires erupting in laboratory outbuildings, enslaved workers vanishing not into escape, but seeming to dissolve into the landscape itself, leaving no trail for dogs to follow. The woman who had once been Eleanor Blackwood returned to find a changed environment. Dr. Carver and his associates had become more cautious in their work, moving their operations deeper into the rural areas and keeping minimal records. But they continued nevertheless, driven by the conviction that their research was necessary for medical advancement and by the economic incentives provided by northern medical schools always seeking anatomical specimens for instruction. Eleanor no longer attempted to pass in white society. The fire that had supposedly claimed her life had also, in a sense, freed her from the constraints of her former identity. Now she moved through the shadows of Wilmington's maritime district, her face concealed not just by the silk scarf, but by a deeper transformation, her very bearing and movement altered by what she had experienced. She found shelter with a community of free black dock workers and their families, people who existed in the margins of Southern society, maintaining a tenuous independence through specialized skills and careful navigation of racial boundaries. Among them was Marion Lewis, a midwife and healer whose grandmother had been born in Dahomey and who recognized in Eleanor something beyond ordinary understanding. "Your bones remember," Marion told her after examining the strange ridges and nodes that had developed along Eleanor's spine and ribs, calcifications that medical science of the time could not have explained. "They've become a resonance chamber." Through Marion's connections, Eleanor re-established contact with Daniel, who had returned to North Carolina after delivering the documents to Philadelphia. Together with a small circle of trusted allies, both free and enslaved, they began what they called the reclamation work. This work took many forms. By night, they conducted expeditions into the cypress swamp, locating and properly burying remains that had been discarded there over the years of Thomas's experiments. They maintained surveillance on Dr. Carver and his associates, documenting their movements and identifying their laboratories. They established a network of communication that allowed them to warn potential victims and occasionally facilitate escapes. But their most significant work involved Eleanor's transformed body. The voices that resonated through her bones had grown more distinct with time, organizing themselves into a coherent archive of knowledge. When she pressed her hands against the earth of a burial site, she could identify who lay beneath. When she touched the walls of a building where atrocities had occurred, she could reconstruct what had happened inside. Marion recognized that Eleanor had become what her people would call a vessel of witness, someone whose body had been opened to carry the experiences of others. Such vessels were dangerous but necessary, bearing knowledge too painful for communities to hold collectively, but too important to forget. On the autumn equinox of 1832, Eleanor and her allies performed a ritual at the site of the former Blackwood plantation, which had been sold after her apparent death and now stood abandoned, the fields untended, and the main house beginning to decay. They gathered at midnight at the eastern storehouse where Thomas had conducted his earliest experiments. The ceremony was not recorded in writing. Such documentation would have been too dangerous. But its outline was preserved in the oral tradition of the Lewis family, passed down through generations and eventually transcribed in the 1930s by Works Progress Administration researchers collecting former slave narratives. Eleanor lay on the earth floor of the storehouse while Marion and 7 others, representing the directions and elements, placed their hands on her body. As they chanted names of the dead, Eleanor's body became a conduit, her voice changing as she spoke the testimonies of those who had suffered there. The voices emerged not just from her mouth, but seemed to emanate from her entire skeletal structure, the bones themselves vibrating with sound. For hours, the testimonies continued. Dozens of accounts from those who had died under Thomas's knife, describing not just their suffering but their resistance, their humanity, their connections to family and community that had persisted despite attempts to reduce them to specimens. The witnesses recorded these testimonies in memory, each person responsible for preserving a portion of the collective account. What they could not know was that they were being observed. Dr. Carver, alerted by a plantation overseer about lights seen at the abandoned property, had come to investigate, bringing with him 2 colleagues. Hidden in the darkness outside the storehouse, they witnessed what they would later describe in private correspondence as a demonstration of mass hysteria unprecedented in medical literature and a ritualistic performance designed to simulate spirit possession. But one detail troubled them deeply. Eleanor Blackwood was speaking of experiments that had never been documented, describing procedures and conversations that had occurred behind closed doors, naming physicians who had visited Thomas's laboratory from as far away as Boston and London. How could she know these things? How could any of them know, unless... The rational mind rejects the impossible, reinterpreting it into familiar categories. Dr. Carver convinced himself that Eleanor had somehow gained access to Thomas's private papers, that the entire performance was an elaborate deception designed to undermine legitimate medical research and incite unrest among the enslaved population. The threat was too significant to ignore. Within days, warrants were issued for the arrest of persons unknown engaged in seditious assembly at the former Blackwood property. A reward was offered for information leading to the identification of those involved. Eleanor and her circle knew immediately that they had been discovered. The reclamation work would have to evolve into something else, something more direct. The time for documentation had given way to the time for action. Marion Lewis understood what few others did, that Eleanor's transformation was not yet complete. The voices that moved through her bones were building towards something, a crescendo of testimony that would break open the silence surrounding decades of medical abuse. But for this testimony to reach those who needed to hear it, Eleanor would need to place herself directly before those who had perpetrated the crimes. The plan they developed was both simple and audacious. Dr. Carver and his colleagues were scheduled to present a paper on differential anatomy and surgical approaches at the North Carolina Medical Society's annual meeting in Raleigh on October 15, 1832. Eleanor would attend not as an accuser, but as evidence herself, the living proof of what their science had created. As the date approached, Eleanor's physical transformation accelerated. The calcifications along her spine became more pronounced, visible through her skin as ridged patterns similar to those found on certain shells or fossils. Her remaining teeth, prosthetics crafted by a sympathetic dentist from ivory and human teeth salvaged from the marsh, began to loosen and shift, seeming to rearrange themselves according to some internal pattern. "The dead are organizing themselves inside me," she told Marion 3 days before they were to depart for Raleigh. "They are preparing to speak as one voice." On the morning they were to leave, Eleanor was found unconscious on the floor of the small room she occupied in the Maritime District. Her body was rigid, her skin burning with fever, the patterns on her spine now pulsing visibly beneath the surface. Marion recognized the crisis. The vessel was overfull. The testimonies were competing for expression, threatening to tear Eleanor's physical form apart in their urgency to be heard. For 2 days and nights, Marion worked to stabilize her, using techniques passed down through generations of healers. She called upon the 7 witnesses from the storehouse ritual to place their hands once more on Eleanor's body, this time not to receive testimony but to help organize the voices, to create harmony from discord. Slowly, Eleanor's fever subsided. The calcifications stabilized, no longer spreading but forming a coherent pattern across her back and chest, a pattern that Marion recognized with astonishment as writing. Not in any European alphabet, but in symbols that her grandmother had shown her, said to originate in temple inscriptions from Dahomey. "The dead have written themselves upon you," Marion whispered when Eleanor finally opened her eyes. "You carry their truth in your flesh." Eleanor's voice, when she spoke, resonated with a quality that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We are ready," she said, and it was clear that the "we" encompassed multitudes. They departed for Raleigh that night, traveling by cart along back roads, avoiding patrols and checkpoints. The confrontation that awaited would transform not just their lives, but the very understanding of what the human body could bear witness to, and what justice might look like when the dead themselves demanded to be heard. The North Carolina Medical Society's annual meeting of 1832 was held in the newly constructed State Capitol building in Raleigh, the limestone and granite structure still partially under scaffolding. The October morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of pristine autumn day that seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to unfold within those marble halls. Dr. William Carver and his associates took their positions at the front of the assembly hall, where nearly 60 physicians from across North Carolina had gathered. Their presentation on differential anatomy and surgical approaches was the culmination of work that had begun with Thomas Blackwood years earlier. Research they believed would revolutionize medical understanding of pain and surgical intervention. As Carver began his opening remarks, the doors at the rear of the hall opened. The assembly turned to see a woman entering slowly, her face partially concealed by a silk scarf, her body moving with a strange, deliberate rhythm. She was accompanied by an older black woman whom several recognized as a midwife from the Wilmington area. "Gentlemen," Carver said, his voice tight with controlled alarm, "we appear to have uninvited guests. Perhaps someone could summon the—" "You know who I am," the scarfed woman said, her voice carrying through the hall with unexpected resonance. "You believed you had silenced me, but you succeeded only in giving me a different voice." She moved to the center of the room and, in a single fluid motion, removed the scarf that had concealed her face. Gasps rose from the assembled physicians. Eleanor Blackwood's jaw showed the ravages of the extractions that had been performed on her. But more shocking were the patterns visible on her skin, a network of raised ridges that formed symbols none of them recognized, extending from her neck downward beneath her clothing. "I have come to correct the record," Eleanor announced. "Not just my own, but that of all those who suffered and died under your knives in the name of scientific advancement." What followed was described in a letter written by Dr. James Harper, a young physician from Edenton who had attended the meeting and who, troubled by what he witnessed, documented the events in correspondence to his brother, a minister in Boston. The letter, preserved in the Harper family papers, provides the only known first-hand account, by someone outside Eleanor's circle. "The woman who had once been Mrs. Blackwood began to speak," Harper wrote. "But it was immediately apparent that the voice was not entirely her own. It possessed a quality I can describe only as composite, as though multiple voices were emerging simultaneously from a single throat, perfectly aligned to create a new voice altogether. For nearly an hour," Eleanor testified, "she named victims and procedures. She quoted private conversations between physicians that had never been recorded. She described experimental techniques that had never been published. And most disturbingly, she explained the underlying philosophy that had guided their work, the belief that certain bodies were inherently different, inherently suitable for experimentation, inherently disposable. You sought to map the architecture of pain, she told the stunned assembly, but succeeded only in building a monument to cruelty. As she spoke, the patterns on her skin seemed to shift and pulse, the symbols rearranging themselves as though the testimony itself was being inscribed upon her body. Several physicians later claimed that the room had grown unnaturally cold during her speech, while others insisted that they had heard whispering voices emerging from the walls themselves. Dr. Carver, recovering from his initial shock, attempted to regain control of the situation. He approached Eleanor with professional concern, speaking loudly enough for all to hear. "Mrs. Blackwood is known to us, gentlemen. She suffered a severe mental break following her husband's death and has been under treatment for delusional fixations. What you are witnessing is a tragic case of—" "Examination," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cutting through his with perfect clarity. "The systematic examination of bodies deemed expendable, like Ruth Morton, purchased by Thomas Blackwood in 1827 for the specific purpose of testing whether pain receptors could be selectively deadened. Or Samuel Davis, on whom you yourself, Dr. Carver, performed exploratory surgery without anesthesia in 1830 to observe the effects of acute trauma on cardiac function." The specificity of her accusations left the room in stunned silence. These were not the ravings of a delusional mind, but precise descriptions of procedures that had indeed been performed, procedures known only to those who had been present. "I stand before you not as one woman," Eleanor continued, "but as many. I carry within me the testimony of those who cannot speak for themselves. My body has become the evidence you sought to bury." Dr. Harper's letter describes what happened next. Mrs. Blackwood then removed her outer garments to reveal her arms and shoulders, upon which were visible the most extraordinary markings I have ever witnessed on human flesh. They appeared as raised patterns, like scarification but more precise, forming what seemed to be text in an alphabet I did not recognize. More disturbing still were the protrusions along her spine, calcifications or growths that formed distinct shapes, almost like small hands reaching outward from within her body. The assembly erupted in chaos. Some physicians rushed forward, their scientific curiosity overcoming their shock. Others backed away in horror or disbelief. Dr. Carver called for Eleanor's immediate detention, claiming she presented a danger to herself and others. In the confusion, Marion Lewis moved swiftly to Eleanor's side. What words passed between them was not recorded, but witnesses described seeing the older woman press her hands to Eleanor's shoulders, as though steadying her for what was to come. Eleanor's final testimony came not in words, but in a demonstration that none present would ever forget or fully explain. She knelt on the marble floor of the assembly hall and pressed her palms flat against its surface. The markings on her skin began to pulse visibly, and from her mouth emerged not a voice but a sound like the creaking of old wood, the rustling of marsh grasses, the distant echo of forgotten cries. The floor beneath her hands seemed to respond. Witnesses described a vibration that passed through the stone itself, traveling outward to the walls and ceiling. Several of the physicians present reported feeling this vibration pass through their own bodies, accompanied by what Dr. Harper described as a sudden, inexplicable knowledge, as though memories not my own had been momentarily grafted into my mind. These borrowed memories contained fragments of experiences: the sensation of a scalpel cutting without anesthesia, the smell of the Eastern storehouse where Thomas had conducted his work, the sound of voices discussing symptoms and responses with clinical detachment while bodies failed beneath their instruments. The phenomenon lasted less than a minute before Eleanor collapsed, the effort apparently exhausting her physical resources. In the stunned silence that followed, Marion Lewis gathered Eleanor in her arms with surprising strength and moved toward the exit. No one tried to stop them. As one physician later confessed in private correspondence, none of us could bring ourselves to touch her after what we had witnessed. It was as though some boundary had been crossed, not by her, but by us, and the consequence of that transgression was now made manifest in her flesh. Eleanor Blackwood and Marion Lewis disappeared from official record after the events at the Capitol. Dr. Carver attempted to organize a search, but found his colleagues suddenly reluctant to participate. Within months, he had relocated his practice to Richmond, Virginia. His reputation in Wilmington mysteriously diminished despite no public accounting of the events in Raleigh. The North Carolina Medical Society's official minutes from the 1832 meeting contain no reference to the disruption. The presentation on differential anatomy is listed as having been postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. No charges were ever filed against Eleanor or Marion. It was as though the entire medical establishment had collectively chosen to forget what they had witnessed. But the effects of Eleanor's testimony rippled outward in subtle ways. Several of the physicians present that day quietly abandoned certain lines of research. Others began to advocate for more stringent ethical guidelines in medical experimentation. Dr. Harper eventually left his practice to become an early voice in the medical wing of the abolitionist movement, citing a profound re-examination of the relationship between medicine and humanity. Stories of Eleanor Blackwood persisted in the oral traditions of coastal North Carolina's Black communities. She became a figure of both history and legend, the woman whose body became a vessel for suppressed truths, whose bones carried the memories of those the world had tried to forget. There are accounts of a woman matching her description appearing at abandoned plantation sites throughout the 1830s and early 1840s. Always accompanied by a small group of witnesses who would help excavate and properly bury remains found on the properties. Some claimed she could identify unmarked graves simply by walking over the ground, her body responding to what lay beneath. The last documented sighting comes from 1847, when a woman believed to be Eleanor was seen at the edge of the cypress swamp where it all began, standing motionless as though listening to voices only she could hear. By then, the patterns on her skin had reportedly spread to cover most of her visible body, transforming her into what one witness described as a living document of forgotten history. The former Blackwood plantation was eventually reclaimed by the landscape, the main house collapsing and the fields returning to forest. But local tradition holds that the Eastern storehouse remained standing for decades longer than should have been possible given its age and construction, as though something was preserving it from within. When it finally fell during a storm in 1887, workers clearing the debris discovered something beneath its foundation. A collection of small bones, carefully arranged in a pattern that formed words in an alphabet none could identify. Beside them lay a single human tooth, worn smooth by time but still intact. Some say that if you walk through the cypress swamp on certain nights when the moon is dark, you can hear voices emerging from the earth itself. Not in fear or pain, but in testimony. They speak not to frighten the living, but to ensure that what happened there is never forgotten. that the truth remains embedded in the landscape just as it once was inscribed in a woman's bones. For the dead do not truly depart. They merely change form, becoming memory, becoming story, becoming truth that waits for those with courage enough to listen. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Please subscribe to the channel to experience more forgotten histories and hidden truths. If this story touched you, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates how the past continues to whisper through the present.